So thanks everyone for joining the call today. Seems like we've got a smaller but intimate group. So the benefit for me is that's going to be able to create more space for questions and kind of hopefully some two-way dialogue. Possibly the consequence for those that are here is that you might be pushed to ask, answer, and jump in if that's not something where a place you like to be. But I want to make sure that we have as productive and meaningful conversation for yourselves. The intentions of today are to really just talk a little bit about the Spark program, the partnership that has been recently formed between Ember and AMHSA, kind of share some learnings and observations that we've gained from working inside municipalities for the last few years, and then how are we bringing those learnings forward into a service that we've partnered on with AMHSA to develop called Spark. Just quickly, for those who don't know, I noticed a few names I've seen before or even had the opportunity to chat with. My name is Jesse Adams. I'm the president and founder of Ember. So I'm super excited to be here, be a part of the conversation going forward and share a little bit about what we've learned and what we've noticed over the last little while as it relates to creating cultures and building psychological health and safe spaces inside of organizations. To just give you a little bit of a roadmap as to how this conversation has progressed. So speaking from an AMHSA perspective, in 2019, there is some evolution to workers' comp as well as OHS legislation, specifically focusing on psychological health and safety inside of the workplace, to which at the time I was working with another organization or leading another organization where we started a conversation in building a service or product that could help support municipalities in implementing or figuring out ways in which they could adapt to the national standard, which is ultimately a framework that you could use to create a psychologically safe workplace. So we ended up partnering, as I said before, I was working with How HR with AMHSA to make the impact group, where we worked with 3 to 4 cities and municipalities. It was a single tier model, so we had kind of one service that people could opt into, and we gained a lot of learnings and insights, which we'll talk a little bit about today as we kind of explore what Spark is. That ultimately, in our conversations with Craig and AMHSA, kind of had them pause and reflect on, what do we need to do for our members, recognizing in one level that a lot of the services that we were providing in the former framework was really focused on larger tier cities and not looking at how we best supporting, say, counties or townships or groups that may not have the same infrastructure or same needs that, say, someone like the city of Calgary might have. So with that and through conversations, we ended up deciding to form something a little different called Spark. And also I went through some changes within the partnership of Howitt to where I ended up forming my own company, Ember Experience, where we lean into psychologically safe cultures and how to build those, how to set norms. One way that you can kind of think about it as a differentiation in terms of Spark as a general comment in relation to how it can be helpful in supporting your work around psychological safety is that what we're trying to do within our organization and what we're bringing into Spark is how do we create programming, services, solutions that are supporting organizations and living up to their values and building the culture that they want to build in order for people to feel psychologically safe within their organization. One way that you can kind of think about it as a differentiation in terms of Spark as a general comment in relation to how it can be helpful in supporting your work around psychological safety is that what we're trying to do within our organization and what we're bringing into Spark is how do we create programming, services, solutions that are supporting organizations and living up to their values and building the culture that they want to build in order for people to feel psychologically safe within their organization. Now, obviously within that, there are components that would be really helpful in implementing and adapting the national standard. One differentiation is that it's not a compliance-based program. Spark. So it doesn't focus on all of the legalities and all of the moving infrastructure of the like 140 plus items in order to check off your box of implementing the national standard. That's something a little different. So before I get too far down the road into our conversation, I'd be curious as a pre-frame if people's mics are unmuted, and feel free to either comment in the chat box, or if you feel comfortable and confident enough, you can jump into unmuting yourself. I'd be curious, when you think about, your experience today, I'd be curious, like, what's top of mind for you today? And it could be something entirely related to Spark, or it could be something that's going on outside of here. So maybe if you want to give a few minutes to pause and reflect, I'd be interested to know what's top of mind for you today as we enter our call.
Hi, good morning. I'm mainly just here to learn more about the program and hear what's happening in the industry and municipalities around psychological health and safety. It's certainly an interest for my organization and my own work.
Cool. I see Kylie mentioned the same thing, just kind of curious to hear about it. Anyone else have something different beyond just like a general curiosity? Christy, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Christy from the city of Grand Prairie. Yes, I can echo that as well. We're looking at what we can do to increase psychological health and safety in our work environment, making sure that we are providing the correct training and opportunity for our staff. So we look at mental health first aid as a kind of regular occurring course, our de-escalating potentially violent situations, and just mental health in general. And then our EAFP and what that has to offer. And if there's opportunity for us to showcase a little bit more. We're also looking at our suicide resource network to be able to add additional training sessions for sessions like Tough Enough to Talk About It, but definitely trying to figure out a nice framework that we can move forward with and continue with, not just these one-offs. So we're really looking at some opportunity to increase our psychological safety within our workplace and being really open and receptive to things and change that's occurring.
Great, thanks for that, Christy. It was really in depth. Appreciate that. Megan, how about yourself?
Hi, Jesse. My name is Megan Shea. I'm the program manager of employee well-being here at the Wood Buffalo municipality of Wood Buffalo. We're really looking at how we can utilize the Spark program to understand what other municipalities are doing as best practices, so for benchmarking reasons, but also expanding the resources. We have a group of employees called Wellness Ambassadors, and we want to be able to provide more tools to kind of our embedded employees to foster these conversations around evolving psychological safety and bringing awareness to all of our employees in each of the areas.
That's cool. Thank you, Megan. My next question that I would have is, so, within the situations that you were just describing and what you're bringing to the conversation or what's on your mind, I'd be curious, would you be able to define and perhaps, those who are just kind of interested in learning about the program could think about, their employees' experience and even potentially how it impacts you. Like, what is the real challenge that you're facing today within those situations? Christy, I think you brought forward the idea of perhaps it's all this like programs that are happening, but how are we connecting the dots or creating a umbrella around that? But I'd be curious if people have something to really reflect on or add in as within what's on your mind. What's the real challenge for those things for you today? Hey, go ahead, Christy.
I think for us, it's just trying to really hone in on what do you choose and what are the rights and what fits criteria really well. So, we look at the 13 factors, we look at Not Myself Today, we look at psychological workplaces. So there's so many options to take into consideration and really just trying to do it right and what is right. And so I think that's what our team is facing with challenge right now, is just really, we hear and we get to participate in all these different things, is what is the actual right piece to do and how can we get it right?
That's so great. I love the words you're using there. and I love the curiosity, because I think it's such a good place to start as to like what is right, because it's likely what I think right is probably different than what you might think it is, than what Megan and Kyle did. And so we apply that to organizations. I think it's such an important context to have, that we sometimes miss. We see all the things around us that have all this best practice, and we come with it, implementing it or providing the solution with the best intentions, and we might not really understand the like the differing perspectives of the people and human beings, in order to create alignment for action and responsibility towards that right. So I love that. That's great.
Jesse, you've heard us say this before at Strathcona County, and it continues to be a challenge, and that is time. So just like Christy was saying, we're trying to do the right thing amongst all these many priorities, or the things that we know are the right thing to do. But being really mindful of time of our leaders and of our staff. There's a lot of competing priorities right now, and we're just trying to figure out what is the best use of our leaders' time. Can we be really succinct and really targeted, so we're meeting the needs of our leaders when it comes to psychological health and safety training or learning or conversations in a way that is the best use of their time, because we only have so much time in our work days, and we don't want to burn out our staff or our leaders. So yeah, just really evaluating our needs beforehand so that we make the most of the time that we do use of theirs.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks, Kylie. And then the last question I have, and then I'll do more talking. When you think about the conversation today and whatever expectations you had coming in, what were you hoping to take from it? Perhaps what would success look like even for you when you're, and again, you can feel free to unmute yourself or add into the chat and share, or you can just reflect on it for yourself, but I'll give another moment or two for reflection.
I feel like I'm talking lots today, but I think for us, it's just some more additional information, better understanding, and more ability to help make decisions and decide. And Kylie, I do really appreciate that comment in regards to time, because it is so important. And that is the other piece of the puzzle, is what do we do with the time, and how do we ensure that we align enough time, and where do we fit that in? So I like all of that stuff.
Yeah, it's such an interesting piece that both of you raise, and that I would say the most consistent factor we're seeing come up through conversations inside of workplaces across organizations, school, health, public health, large commercial communication organizations, municipalities, manufacturing groups, operation groups, power organizations. There seems to be this common theme of time and space, and that there's not enough of it. And it's a real challenge in that it seems to be something that's perpetuating a lot of the current issues, while also a reality of the demands of today, and trying to figure out that tension of how possibly do we work within the boundaries of the time and space we do have, or while also looking for ways to expand that when we can. And we're seeing this come up in multiple places and ways. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In terms of our conversation today, what I'm going to share with you is just some observations we've had around the current state of municipalities. Some of you who've heard me speak before some of it might feel familiar, and there might even be some nuances and differences in those elements. Then we'll give you a brief overview of Spark and what it looks like, as well as briefly touch on some of the other services that are a part of the partnership, and then ultimately give some space for questions and discussion for how it would be best for you. So in terms of some shifts that we've noticed, we've bucketed them into three large buckets, but I'm going to speak to each of them individually. So the first one that we've really noticed some shifts inside of the municipal environment in the last number of years are within the workplace experience itself, or the environment. And we're seeing this happen through as a result of a few different things. So number one is that we're seeing a ton of operational change in a high degree of frequency as well as intensity, where it's like completely reshifting the work, how we do it, the tools we use to do the work. We're noticing this quite a lot where we're seeing restructuring happening in a significant way. And what's really fascinating within this one, and we were just doing some work with a municipality yesterday, where the staff perspective was, okay, just went through all this change. I can see the good of it now. I'm hopeful that we are now going to shift into a bit of more of a stability experience. And when leadership, and speaking of leadership, their kind of story is typically for this particular group was, we're just starting the change, and we have this vision and pathway we want to head down in order to make it all happen. And so you see this like almost polarized continuum going on, where deep fatigue, deep tired, seeking for stability and groundedness, while also at the leadership table wanting to continue to evolve, whether that's through like the objectives of the from council or even within their own department. And we're finding that this is really creating tension inside of the organization, and even disconnect and friction, and possibly even armoring of perspectives of us versus them. The other element that we're really noticing coming up is how we show up to the space. And for me, that really speaks to the values that we hold and the behaviors we do to support those values. We've noticed that they are being redefined quite significantly, particularly if you think about like in the municipal sector, traditionally maybe not as flexible within their work arrangements, around homework and in office. And now there's kind of sometimes a hybrid culture, if not fully remote. And so needing to resort out, like, how do we best live the values we care about? We're hearing things around connection. There's a lot of tension where perhaps connection was best exemplified through physical space and having lunches with each other, or bringing in like potlucks as a way of, again, furthering that connection, where if now we're remote, perhaps those are a little bit harder to do. And so unsure of how do we actually live up to that. We're also seeing very differing definitions possibly, and even behaviors that could be used to best live the values. So one that I find really comes up and resonates for many is the one around respect. We're seeing respect as a really evolving term around the expectations of what it might be, and how it's been reshaped within kind of our past lives. Even if I think about when I was young, respect had a lot to do with acknowledging power over. You even think about your family, like if my grandpa came into the room, you got up and gave him your seat. You got him the drink, you cleaned off his dish, or if he was saying something, you didn't speak when he was speaking, or you didn't like challenge the ideas at all. You just kind of sat there and listened. Whereas now we're seeing a lot of the behaviors that organizations seem to be shifting to that support respect are kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. There are things around like challenging power, creating equity, trying to diminish the impacts of power over, as opposed to, hold it with such regard, ideas around like walk with our staff. And so what's really fascinating we're seeing is that what can happen at times is that inside of one culture, you can have two pockets of people living respect in completely different ways, but pointing at each other as not being respectful. And again, another space where it's creating a lot of tension, and that we haven't taken the time to effectively understand and perhaps redefine what that word is. So even when you used the word earlier, Christy, around right, what is right? Because if we think about, stuff around, say, social justice as an example, the term of right in the current system that has been created comes with a certain connotation and has been built out of a certain perspective that might not have included varying other perspectives, whether it's Indigenous or other marginalized communities. And so again, why we need to even reshape what is right is a tough thing to answer, because it can be often very culturally dependent upon where you're at, who's in your space, and all that type of stuff. The next thing that we find is an added element to that is recognizing that our brains are still, we're seeing, even though this has been something we noticed during COVID, it's still happening in this increased threat response and even reduced capacity. We're noticing a bunch of people just feeling exhausted, being tired, again, not having enough time or capacity to do the work. Perhaps we look at human beings as like having a finite amount of capacity, but the demands that we're seeing placed on these people are twice or 3 times more. So if you think you had 10 brain units to do all the stuff you're supposed to do in a given day, we're noticing that the expected requirements are like 20 or 30 brain units worth of work, and it's just not possible. And so this kind of, we're on a treadmill that we can't quite keep up to, really seems to be something that's going on that, again, creates some friction inside of the work environment. And then finally, just as what's happening in organizations, individuals are really re-examining their wants and needs. You know, I'm sure many of you are in tune with some of the commentary in the media around like quiet quitting and all of that kind of stuff and what that looks like. And there's been some really challenging perspectives to have around like, is it actually like disengagement, or are people just like putting better boundaries around their expectations for life and work and blending those two things together? Perhaps the expectation of me working 10, 12 hours a day is something I don't want to do anymore. I want to work 8 hours a day. And that's actually what's more aligned to the contract I have. And meanwhile, that could be perceived as someone who doesn't care or isn't willing to go the extra mile or have all these different elements with it. But ultimately, we find it could be stemming from people really re-examining what's important to me and how do I find space where I can live that. And we're seeing this go on quite significantly and creating tension again inside of the workplace. The next big bucket we're noticing is around leadership. So you see the bullet there where leaders are often having less answers. What I really mean with that is the paradigm of leadership is shifting. If you look at some of the traditional models in leadership over the last 30 to 40 years, it was a lot of times those who became leaders were the smartest of the function because they were the best accountant. They became head of accounting, then they became CFO and so on. And the way in which they got there was that they got really good at solving problems. They got really good at having answers. And a part of that came from that a lot of the problems that were being pushed to solve had a definitive answer to them. So over the last 30 years, we were focused a lot on efficiency. So that's like resourcing. How quickly can we build it? How quickly can we execute it? Lowering cost. And so these have definitive answers. Whether we can get to them or not may not have happened. And not to suggest it was easy to always get to them, but they had a very defined, finite answer to them. Whereas what we're seeing now within leadership is the problems that are being presented with are extremely complex if they even have an answer to begin with. So when you talk about something like social equity, talk about something like supporting mental health, psychological safety, what is the answer to doing that thing? And it's really quite challenging to think about. There's not one person that's going to have that, but ultimately it creates a lot of friction at a leadership perspective where you're used to solving the problems. And now I don't know how to solve the problems. And that can create a lot of shame, fear, embarrassment, and really interesting internal issues where as leaders, our egos can start flying off unless we start to create a more curious approach and ask better questions. And then we're seeing that big shift happening. The next one we're seeing is the greater recognition that control and fear is not something that's going to maximize the productivity of my people. Using the carrot or the stick or my power to influence your behavior or control your behavior, we're seeing push against that. And that's requiring a huge shift from a leader perspective of how do I walk with my staff? How do I create influence? How do I create trusting relationships? How do I be mindful of the emotional bank account I'm building with the people around me? And then at an interesting paradigm is because we might be accustomed or even more comfortable with using more punitive control type tactics, it can feel really difficult, if not impossible, to even maintain accountability. So the people, we're hearing it time and time again when speaking with leaders, is that there's no accountability inside the workplace anymore. And I don't know how to do it because perhaps, the discipline methods or the written notices and such is not really getting the job done, or even we feel like we can't even use it because there's not the same abilities because it might be challenged, or we're even hearing that leaders are worried that I could be perceived as harassing my staff. And so how do we create boundaries within those relationships is a really important part and ultimately a key element of psychological safety as well. And then finally, there's this increased expectation that the whole person is something you need to support as a leader. Previously, as a leader, your primary thing was to maximize the function of that asset that you had, and that all you were doing is about, again, whatever function they did, All you need to focus on, if they're accounting, making sure their bookkeeping is going on. Where now we're being more mindful of that whole person. And that's just a segment of who they are. We're looking at the whole human being. And so this can create a lot of unrest, particularly when we think about the workplace experience. And again, those where power was held, emotions wasn't something that was often included. In fact, it was often looked at as a thing of weakness. And so now we're saying, yeah, bring all your emotions, bring all your stuff, bring your identities, bring your race, bring all your religion, all this into the workplace, and I'm going to best support you. It can feel very daunting and very terrifying as an individual who was previously taught that none of that's accepted. And so again, it seems to really be creating friction where we're hearing from leaders, I don't even know what to do anymore. I don't know how to lead. I don't know how to manage. And it's creating a lot of concern and a lot of extra demands on that position. And again, even potentially risks around psychological health and safety. And then finally, we're seeing evolving expectations from an employee perspective. One around being engaged in two-way dialogue. So I'm not just going to be sitting here being spoken at. I want to be a part of building the strategies, be a part of the conversation. There's expectations where people are curious now about, what's your perspective on social justice? What's your perspective on climate change? What's your perspective on mental health, on work flexibility? All these big conversations that were previously not a part of the workplace experience, they're now becoming table stakes entry points as to whether someone will choose to work there or even stay there. And organizations are now needing to have very public conversations about these things. Finally, next is around employees feeling that they're seen, heard, and welcomed, and that they can bring their whole self, as I mentioned earlier, to the space, and then ultimately that they're engaged and empowered, particularly around expectations from their leader. We're seeing it's a lot more of okay, how is my leader facilitating a process for me to help solve the problem, as opposed to I go to my leader and they solve the problem for me. And so this again, shift of wanting to feel that the stuff I'm doing matters and it's purposeful. And these are big shifts that we're noticing inside of the workplace experience, and again, are coming up inside municipalities in really interesting ways. As you're ultimately, a lot of the work you're doing is designed to be focused on supporting a healthy community. Any questions on that before I shift into some of the product stuff, or any things that would like clarification on, or challenge, or see something you want to add to? If I don't see any hands raised, I'll just assume we're good. Great. Okay, and so in terms of Spark, so Spark was a program for municipal government members to support building psychologically safe workplaces. It provides those who are participating access to a community of learning, some coaching and tools to help in doing, building that psychologically safe space. In terms of the forming of it, we actually built it out of a bunch of feedback over the last 3 years, where we are able to evolve the way in which we're supporting our participants, which we'll talk specifically about in a second. In terms of the main learnings that we had, there's a few that came up. So some of the major challenges that we learned from those 3 years is one, the absolute importance, and when it wasn't there, the issues that could be had around leadership commitment. And this doesn't necessarily mean that leaders didn't think it was important, but just as what both Christy and Kylie were mentioning earlier, there's 900 other things that are going on, and ultimately this might not be thought of as our primary objective as a leader is to ensure we have psychologically safe workplaces. I have a function that I lead and I'm supposed to be supporting, but recognizing that was at times a challenge, and how to garner that and foster that support and commitment from a leadership perspective. The second element that we saw was around collaboration, both internally inside of the municipality themselves, where things could feel like they're happening in a pocket, perhaps within the HR team themselves or the OHS team itself, and not expanding across the organization. And then we did even notice at times, and it's interesting, when we did this first session a few months ago or last month, it kind of came up again, where there can feel like there's a guardedness at times in sharing across municipalities. We found within the first version of the group, it took probably a half a year to, almost 3/4 of a year for those walls to be broken down and that armor to be taken off, where we can share a bit more vulnerably and support one another authentically, as we're ultimately trying to strive towards the same thing inside of our respective places. Another one that came out was obviously the competing demands. Now we were fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, that this was happening during COVID, which created some really interesting paradigms and things we had to respond to. But really, again, that there's going to be multiple priorities, and how do we embed this type of work within that? And then finally, how are we ensuring the clarity and alignment of the roles and resources to execute it? Were some other piece of feedback that we received. In terms of what was creating the most value, one of the most commented on elements was around the space to reflect and share with colleagues. So that where there's that building of community of support, where we noticed within the differing municipalities, we saw a lot of cross collaboration and even sharing of policies and things like that to help in implementing inside of their own space. Another one that got tagged was, recognizing that this is a whole shared responsibility model and that we all have a role to play. This isn't just something that's on the table of the OHS or the HR person who's been tagged with psych safety. It's meant to be a whole organizational initiative. And although we can have all the programs and things going, this is ultimately going to be moved forward through the culture, through the behaviors of our leaders, of our staff. And so really leaning in and recognizing, creating awareness to that. Also, the deep importance that leaders play within setting the tone of the space, and how influential, when there is good buy-in and good role modeling, that can be in moving the initiatives forward. And then finally, some resources that can be used to help in starting or evolving the conversation. So some particular ones that got tagged was, getting the conversation going around empathy or vulnerability, or even what psych safety is and what the role is for all of us to play within it. They've identified our former program did a nice job of doing that. And so what we tried to do was figure out ways in which we can recognize some of the challenges and realities of working inside a municipality, while continue to bring forward some of the things that were creating value. And ultimately, we hope you see that when we get to some of the program makeup itself. In terms of how it can be really helpful for you, really you can center around creating that community of learning and sharing of best practices across groups. And when we say best practices in this context, it's not only, what is the CSA telling us to do, or whatever paper, or the Guardian Minds, or the consulting firm over here, but ultimately, how do we take something that can feel, very complex, very hard to get my hands around, and make it applied into the day-to-day experience within inside of your organization? Because sometimes what might be best as it relates to those frameworks might not be best as it relates to operationalizing inside of your company, because within those frameworks, there's a lot of presuppositions around some of the infrastructure that's available, around the evolution of a management system and that type of stuff that may or may not be realistic given the size and the space in which you're operating inside of your own company or your own municipality. We find that this can help in better understanding the cultural priorities and gaps within staff experience. So something that we wanted to shift intentionally towards within this particular one is recognizing the importance that is played with acknowledging our current experiences. At times we find we can get ourselves so fixated on wanting to solve the problem that we fail to recognize, understand, validate, and really have compassion about what's it like today inside of the organization. And so within our current model, we've actually layered in some services around facilitating those conversations inside of your particular municipality, so that we can ultimately capture the voice of staff in moving forward, as opposed to just bringing this at you. We want this to feel as you're able to walk with your staff and be mindful of the cultural realities, because we find that the success of this is often more based in the culture and norms of the organization than it is of the more structural elements that could be there. We are hoping to bridge silos and align and refine those departmental priorities within the strategies through some of the assessment models, through some of the training, and even some of the coaching that you can end up receiving. Provide very leader-focused and individual-focused insights and kind of coaching towards creating that collaborative and curious culture. So when we say that, it's ultimately like some access to training programs that are, from a leader perspective, focused on how do I better support human beings inside of the workplace. We're noticing that as a big area of focus, which might have traditionally been known as like softer skills. But ultimately, how do I support this person that might have some mental health challenges? Or how do I foster influence within my team? And on the individual level, how do we get clarity within ourselves? How do we be mindful of our values? How do we get understanding of our emotional awareness and how that shows up? And ultimately, what can we be doing to charge our own batteries and fostering a culture we want to be a part of? And then finally, some additional resources and practices that can really be responsive to the current needs and changes within the municipality over the year that we'd be working together. So in terms of forming this program, we wanted to provide services and support in 3 different areas. So one, to organizations, where our belief is that organizations have the responsibility to create the space for their team. Leaders have the responsibility to facilitate that space, and individuals have the responsibility to contribute with it. Now, there's a bunch of bullets below here, which are some things that we've tagged as very impactful through the conversations we've been having with organizations. Some of them may resonate, some of them may not. But I think looking at it through that lens can be really helpful, and that we all have responsibility to create our current environment. The responsibility just may vary depending on the power and privilege and whatnot that we may have. And without creating a space for people to walk into, whatever individual skills and capacities are going to be had, it's ultimately going to kind of fall down short. We will say, like, if you can envision an employee, doing all the coping skills, sleeping the 8 hours, eating the right nutrition, exercising, mindfulness, writing. And then what we can see sometimes is when they come into their office space, go up the elevator and the doors open, it's like all of that comes crashing down if we've got a toxic culture or the environment doesn't support and amplify that individual resilience. And so for us, it's so critical to ensure that we're appropriately placing our focus, because it can feel easy to say, oh, let's just do more individual resilience. But again, that's only going to get us so far if every time we walk in, people are dropping bricks on our head. And so within the programming, the way that we structured the program is that we created 4 different levels. And I'll go through some of the more tangible elements in a second. But at a high level, the Connect is focused on individual leaders. So this is a program where individuals themselves, whether that's HR, OHS, or even managers and people leaders within inside of the municipality, can come to, receive quarterly or 4 times a year connection points where we, present what are we learning about right now, what's a hot topic, facilitate some dialogue amongst the group in solving and addressing that issue. There's some additional coaching and support, as well as access to an online forum. So this is a really good service level for people who might require some individual support, but may not have or be prepared right now for the larger corporate initiative. Community to culture, they're all focused on organizational and cultural initiatives, and they just vary in terms of their complexity of service, as well as some of the actual service tools within them. And so for community, that's perhaps ones that just want to stay connected, more focused within the municipal best practices, get a little bit of resources, a little bit of training opportunity, versus Cultivate becomes a much more in-depth training opportunity, a little bit more strategic support and infrastructure, then all the way to cultural, where we start to actually do some work in assessing and examining the actual culture of the organization or respective departments, if there's one that you wanted to focus in on. And so that the variance within those is broken down here, where you can see at the cultural one, we do a function called a listening tour, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But as I said earlier, the real variance becomes Connect is more individual based, Now, for municipalities that may have multiple participants, they'd want to be a part of that. There are some pricing opportunities within that for like bulk pricing, whereas community cultivate cultural perhaps would be more for yourselves who would be implementing the strategies and doing the larger strategic initiatives inside of the organization. Before I continue on to a la carte services and kind of give a little bit more color to some of the training and development and even listening to her elements, is there any immediate questions at the high level overview at all right now? All right. So within the a la carte services, the intention behind this was to be able to better respond to the individual need. So perhaps like a package program might not be best based on where you're at as a municipality. And so this type of service can be helpful if you might need to do some pre-work prior to engaging in something more large scale. So whether that's around like fostering buy-in or again, specifically addressing a cultural need where there's friction within a department, perhaps providing training or even providing support for your leadership team and or respective individual leaders. We wanted to provide some opportunity for services within each of these. And this is just some rough pricing to give you a sense as to what it might look like. In terms of getting more detail and really being able to ask more in-depth questions around the needs of your particular group. We can always have follow-up calls, or you can reach out to either myself or AMHSA to help navigate that. But the listening tour from a functional process is really comprised of interviews and focus groups. The piece that's not highlighted within the bullets is the experience that's had. We find with our team, something we're really great at doing is creating that vulnerable space where we can explore really hard conversations and even reframe, work to understand and validate perspectives so that we can create better alignment going forward. Within the leader alignment service, that's really focused on helping a leadership group frame and commit to a culture going forward. We found inside of municipalities that at times, if at the very senior table, there's some friction and the environment that's created around them can add to that, where you have very potentially siloed operational verticals within a municipality that can create a sort of defensiveness around resources. And perhaps, the operational group versus corporate services might get really, armored in those conversations. And so we found a lot of success in working at that table and helping to create alignment, create understanding, and form a culture that can then filter through the whole municipality. Any questions or comments at all right now? I guess as we look to wrap up and open up for that, if you are interested for more, you can follow it. You can check us out online. I think there's even some links at the AMHSA website. You can also reach out to Alana at alana@amhsa.net or Bethany at emberexperience.ca. And we'd love if you'd be open to follow us. You can find AMHSA on LinkedIn, as well as you can search Ember Experience on LinkedIn and track us down, where both parties have regular content coming up, both relating to Spark as well as just general leadership, psychological safety, and mental health practices.